In the small town of Linares, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests, there was a restaurant known only to the locals. Grandma's Cafe was at the end of a long, winding road surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. Occasionally, travelers who took back roads stumbled upon it by chance, although few stayed for long. There was something unsettling about the place. The faded sign, the peeling paint, and the strange silence that hung in the air even on the busiest days. For the people of Linares, it was a tradition. Everyone knew Grandma, an elderly woman who had run the place for longer than anyone could remember. She never seemed to age, her face always wrinkled, her sunken eyes watching everything around her. One afternoon, a young couple, Julia and Mateo, were returning from a camping trip when their car started to fail. The gas gauge was dangerously close to empty, and the road ahead was nothing but darkness. They felt relief when they saw the faint glow of Grandma's Cafe in the distance. They stopped under the old sign, which creaked in the wind. Inside, the restaurant was empty except for Grandma, who was behind the counter with a strange smile. "Come in, dears," she said in a low, hoarse voice. "I was expecting you." Mateo looked at Julia, feeling a shiver run down his spine. How could she know they were coming? But they were hungry, tired, and desperate, so they sat in a booth near the window trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The menu was simple: burgers, fries, and milkshakes, the typical fare of a small diner. Grandma approached their table, notebook in hand, her eyes never leaving them. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice now barely a whisper. "2 burgers and 2 milkshakes, please," Julia said, forcing a smile. Grandma wrote something down and went back to the kitchen. The couple sat in silence. The ticking of a clock on the wall was the only sound in the room as they waited. Mateo noticed something strange. The photos hanging on the walls showed customers dressed in clothes from different eras, some from decades ago. But what disturbed him the most was a particular photo. A man and a woman sitting in the same booth they were in. The most unsettling part was that these people looked exactly like him and Julia. "Hey, Julia," he whispered, pointing at the photo. "That looks like us." Julia leaned in to take a closer look, her breath catching for a moment. The resemblance was uncanny. The couple in the photo had the same expressions, the same posture, but they couldn't be them. Before they could speak further, Grandma returned with the food. The burgers looked perfect, almost too perfect. The buns shone under the dim lights, the meat juicy, but the smell was off. Mateo hesitated, looking at the burger in front of him. "Is something wrong?" Grandma asked, her voice sharper, her eyes narrowing. Mateo shook his head, not wanting to offend her. "It's fine," he muttered, taking the burger. But as he took the first bite, his stomach turned. There was something metallic in the taste, something bad. He put the burger back on the plate and wiped his mouth. "Maybe we should leave," Julia whispered nervously. Mateo nodded, feeling a cold sweat on the back of his neck. They got up to leave, but Grandma blocked their way, her wrinkled hand grabbing Mateo's arm with surprising strength. "You haven't finished your food," she said, her voice now guttural as if something was stuck in her throat. "We're not hungry anymore," Julia said, trembling. Grandma's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "But you must stay. Everyone stays." The restaurant's lights flickered, and for a moment everything changed. The walls seemed smaller, the air became heavy and dense, and the distant sound of cars on the road vanished, leaving only a deep silence. Mateo looked towards the door, but it was gone. The entrance through which they had arrived had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. "What's happening?" he shouted, panic in his voice. Grandma smiled, showing yellow, sharp teeth. "The restaurant needs to feed its own," she said. Suddenly, the photos on the walls began to distort. The faces of the customers blurred, turning into unrecognizable figures. The couple in the photo that resembled them was now decayed, their faces twisted in agony. Mateo grabbed Julia's hand and pulled her towards the back of the restaurant, searching for another exit. They stumbled into the kitchen where the smell of rotten meat hit them. The counters were covered with blood-stained knives, and chunks of meat hung from hooks on the ceiling. Julia screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. They had to get out. They ran towards the back door, but it was rusty and locked. Mateo kicked it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Behind them, Grandma's footsteps echoed in the kitchen. "There's no escape," she whispered. Julia turned and saw figures moving in the shadows. The other customers, the ones from the photos, were emerging, their faces disfigured by suffering, their eyes empty. "We have to try the front door again," Mateo said, pulling her. They ran back to the dining area. But the place had changed. The booths were now filled with skeletal figures, their hands resting on the tables, their empty eyes watching. "Welcome," Grandma's voice echoed in the air. In a last attempt to escape, Mateo grabbed a chair and threw it against the window, but it didn't break. The glass rippled as if it were water, reflecting two twisted, deformed figures trapped forever. Grandma appeared behind them, her eyes glowing with a yellowish light. "No one leaves," she murmured. The walls closed in, the air grew heavier, and then everything went dark. There was a truck driver named Lucas who had been on the road for hours, much longer than he should have without resting. His eyes were heavy, and the rain pounding against the windshield made it even harder to stay awake, as his truck moved along a desolate road in the middle of nowhere. He cursed himself for taking that route. He had heard rumors from other truck drivers about this stretch, stories of disappearances and accidents, but he had never been the superstitious type. That night, however, everything felt strange. Just as he was about to pull over and take a nap in his cab, he saw it, the dim lights of a restaurant up ahead. It was odd considering he hadn't passed any signs for miles, nor had he seen another vehicle in hours. The rain-soaked parking lot was empty except for a few scattered cars, but the worn-out sign above the restaurant's door flickered, casting a tempting glow. "Marta's Restaurant," the sign read. Simple enough. His stomach growled, and he thought a coffee would help him stay awake for the rest of the journey. He parked his truck, stepped out into the cold and misty rain, and walked toward the entrance. The moment he set foot inside, Lucas felt a strange warmth, almost uncomfortably warm for such a small place. The place was nearly empty except for a few patrons, an elderly couple sitting in a booth in the corner, a man alone at the counter drinking coffee, and a waitress wiping down tables. The air smelled of old grease and stale coffee, a familiar scent for Lucas after so many nights on the road. The waitress looked at him and smiled. "Sit wherever you like," she said with a sweet voice, but something about her didn't quite fit, as if it were more routine than a genuine welcome. Lucas nodded and slid into a booth near the window, still damp from the rain. Outside, the fog had thickened, surrounding the restaurant as if isolating it from the rest of the world. The waitress approached with a notepad in hand. Her name tag read, Sophia. She had a fixed smile on her face, but her eyes were vacant, lifeless. "What can I get you?" she asked, ready to write. "Just a coffee and a burger," Lucas said, not in the mood for conversation. He glanced out the window, but all he could see was the fog. He was about to turn back when something moved in the mist, just a flicker, like a shadow passing by quickly. Sophia didn't move. She stood there, still smiling, her pen hovering above the notepad. "Coffee and a burger?" she repeated slowly, her voice somehow different, more monotonous. Lucas frowned. "Yes, coffee and a burger. Are you all right?" She blinked once, twice, and then, without saying another word, turned and headed to the kitchen. Her movements were clumsy, almost robotic. Lucas watched her disappear into the back, a sense of unease growing inside him. Something was off about this place. As he sat there, he started to notice the details. The elderly couple hadn't touched their food, their heads bowed toward their plates. The man at the counter didn't move either, just stared into his coffee, motionless. The restaurant was too quiet. There was no noise from the kitchen, no conversations, only the hum of the flickering lights. Lucas's instincts told him he should leave, get up, and walk out the door, but something kept him in his seat, as if an invisible force held him back. The bell above the door rang and his heart jumped. He turned, expecting to see someone walk in, but instead, the door swung open to the night, letting the fog drift into the room. There was no one there. He stood there, staring at the open entrance with the fog swirling just outside, but no one entered. The bell continued to ring, its echo repeating in the empty restaurant. Lucas stood up, his hands trembling. "Hello?" he called out to the waitress. There was no response. The kitchen door swung slightly from when Sophia had entered, but no one came out. Lucas's instincts kicked in again, and this time he didn't ignore them. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, but just as he reached it, it slammed shut in front of him with a deafening crash. The bell immediately fell silent. He pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't move, as if something was holding it shut from the other side. His heart began to race. He turned back toward the interior of the restaurant, but the place had changed. The customers were no longer sitting motionless. The elderly couple had disappeared, their booth empty. The man at the counter had turned toward him, his eyes open and glassy, his skin pale and lifeless. The lights above flickered violently, casting strange shadows on the floor. Lucas backed away, his breathing heavy. The kitchen door slowly creaked open, and from the darkness a figure emerged. It was Sophia, the waitress, but her face had deformed into something disturbing. Her smile had stretched grotesquely. Her skin was pale and her eyes were dark as the night. She didn't say anything, just stood there, tilting her head as she watched him with that ghastly smile. The other customers began to rise, their movements slow, their eyes vacant. Panic surged through him as he backed away, his hand gripping the door handle. He pulled at it once more, and this time it opened with a jolt, letting in the cold, damp air. Without looking back, Lucas ran toward his truck, his hands trembling as he tried to start the engine, his heart pounding. Finally, the engine roared, and he floored the gas, speeding away from the restaurant and the horrors he had left behind. Hours later, when the rain stopped and the fog cleared, he reached a truck stop. He was still shaking as he stepped out of the truck, his mind unable to process what had happened. He approached a group of truck drivers gathered outside another restaurant. "Have any of you ever heard of Marta's restaurant?" he asked. The truckers exchanged glances. One of them, an older man, shook his head. "There's no Marta around here, buddy. There hasn't been anything on that stretch for years." Lucas frowned. "No, I just stopped there. It's about 80 kilometers down the old road." The older man gave him a serious look. "Buddy, that place burned down 30 years ago. There's nothing left." Lucas's blood ran cold. He looked back down the road he had come from, remembering the flickering lights and Sophia's disturbing smile. He didn't know what he had seen that night, but he was sure of one thing. He would never go back to that place. There was a restaurant on the outskirts of Santa Cruz del Valle, a small and little frequented town. The place was known only to a small group, locals who knew it wasn't just any restaurant. It was called the Midnight Grill, and those who knew about it described it as an establishment where no one should set foot unless they were brought there by someone else. It only opened after midnight, and those who went there didn't always return. The rumors about the place spoke of people disappearing and darker things happening within its walls. Tomas, a truck driver used to long routes, found himself driving on a lonely road after his GPS failed, causing him to get lost. He had been driving for more than 20 hours, and fatigue was starting to take its toll. He hadn't eaten anything all day, and just when he was beginning to wonder if he would find anywhere to stop, he saw it. A small, solitary restaurant called the Midnight Grill, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. There were no other vehicles in the parking lot except for a few old cars, but Tomas was hungry and too tired to be picky. The restaurant had an outdated look, as if it had been plucked from another era. The warm light it emitted from inside contrasted with the darkness outside, giving Tomas a false sense of security. He entered, grateful for the warmth that greeted him. Inside there were only a few people, a couple in a corner and a man eating alone at the counter. Behind the bar, an older man dressed in a white apron greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the Midnight Grill. Sit wherever you like," the man said with a hoarse voice. Tomas took a seat in a booth near the window. Outside, the fog enveloped the parking lot, obscuring everything beyond a few meters. The man in the apron approached with a notepad in hand and asked what he'd like to order. Tomas, hungry, glanced at the menu, which was short but promised hearty food. Burgers, fries, coffee. But what caught his attention the most was an option at the bottom of the menu, the house special with no description. "What's the special?" Tomas asked, expecting something simple. The man smiled, but his eyes remained dark. "It's something that will fill you up and keep you awake for a long time. Do you want it?" Tomas, not thinking much about the strange response, nodded. "Yes, give me the special and a coffee." The man nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Tomas alone with his thoughts. As he waited, something about the place began to make him uncomfortable. The couple in the corner wasn't talking or eating. They were simply sitting there, staring blankly into space. The man at the counter wasn't moving either, and the entire place was shrouded in a silence that felt thicker than the air itself. The older man soon returned with a plate covered by a metal lid. When he lifted it, a dark, juicy burger appeared, but there was something strange about its appearance. The meat was blacker than any Tomas had ever seen, and the smell wasn't pleasant. It had a metallic tinge that turned his stomach. "What's in this burger?" Tomas asked, feeling increasingly uneasy. The man only smiled, turned around and went back to the counter without saying another word. Tomas hesitated for a moment, but his hunger pushed him to try the burger. As soon as he took a bite, he felt something was off. The taste wasn't normal. There was an unpleasantly strong metallic flavor in the meat, as if it had been soaked in something he couldn't identify. As he chewed, his vision began to blur, and the atmosphere of the restaurant changed almost imperceptibly. He looked around. The couple in the corner was no longer in their booth. The man at the counter was staring at him with vacant, lifeless eyes. Tomas tried to stand up, but his legs felt heavy, as if they were glued to the floor. The place began to close in around him, and the door through which he had entered was no longer there. Suddenly the older man appeared again behind the counter, his smile now grotesque, his eyes reflecting a deep darkness. "You've eaten the special, Tomas, and now you belong to the Midnight Grill," he said in a chilling tone. Tomas got up, staggering, desperate to escape, but the place had changed. The customers who had been sitting still now surrounded him, moving toward him unnaturally. Their bodies looked fragile and thin, like shadows of what they once were. Desperate, Tomas ran toward a window and tried to break it, but the glass wouldn't shatter. In his reflection, he could barely recognize his own face, distorted and pale. As the other customers approached, the man behind the counter continued to watch him with that disturbing smile, and before Tomas could do anything else, everything went black. The next morning, the road through Santa Cruz del Valle was empty. There was no trace of the restaurant, only a deserted highway and trees that seemed to close in over the asphalt. No one ever heard from Tomas again, like so many others who unknowingly ate the special at the Midnight Grill. It was late and Anna was lost. She had been driving for hours on a desolate road with no GPS signal and hadn't seen a soul for miles. The road seemed endless, flanked by dark trees and shadows that seemed to close in around her. The moonless night and thick fog made each mile feel even longer. Her stomach growled and exhaustion was taking over as she blinked to stay awake. Just when she thought about stopping to check the map, a dim light appeared in the distance. Through the fog, she managed to see a small restaurant with a flickering neon sign. It read, "The Night Griller, open 24 hours." She hadn't seen any other establishment for hours, and hunger and fatigue pushed her to stop. Anna parked her car in the small gravel lot. The place seemed abandoned. There were no other cars around. Something about the air felt strange, but the promise of a hot meal was stronger than her discomfort. Inside, the restaurant was small and seemed cozy. Red vinyl booths and a jukebox in one corner gave it a nostalgic feel. However, the atmosphere was eerily silent. There were no other customers, nor the usual sounds of a kitchen at work. Behind the counter, a lone man was cleaning with slow movements. Even though he hadn't turned toward her, Anna felt that he knew she was there, as if he had been waiting for her. The door closed behind her and the man turned slowly, revealing a gaunt face with sunken eyes that seemed to stare too intensely. "Welcome to the Night Griller," he said in a raspy voice. "Sit wherever you like." Anna settled into a booth by the window, though she could barely see beyond the thick fog that surrounded the place. She picked up the menu, noticing her hands were trembling slightly. It was a simple menu: burgers, fries, breakfast items. But the letters on the menu seemed to move before her eyes, as if she couldn't focus on them properly. The man approached with a notepad in his hand but didn't really look at what he was writing. "What will you have?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "A coffee and a burger, please," Anna said, trying to sound casual. The man nodded and headed to the kitchen, disappearing behind the swinging doors. The place fell back into that strange silence. The restaurant's atmosphere had a heaviness that made it hard to relax, as if something invisible was watching her. She looked out the window, trying to distract herself, but her attention was caught by a figure that seemed to be standing in the fog, barely visible. Anna froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Was there someone outside? She blinked and the figure vanished. Her stomach churned with fear and every instinct inside her screamed that she should leave as soon as possible. Moments later, the man returned with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate holding a burger. The food looked almost too perfect. The bun gleamed under the restaurant's lights. However, The smell coming from the plate was strange, like rusty metal and a sweet hint that turned her stomach. "I'm not that hungry," Anna said, pushing the plate aside slightly. The man stood there watching her with an empty smile. "You must eat," he said softly. "It's fresh." "I think I'll take it to go instead," Anna replied, trying to stay calm while panic began to set in. The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You can't leave yet. You haven't finished your meal," he said in a harsh tone, her stomach twisted with fear. "Really, she began to say, but at that moment the restaurant door flew open with a violent crash, and a gust of cold air extinguished the lights. The place plunged into darkness. Anna could still see the man standing in front of her, his silhouette barely lit by the faint glow of the neon sign outside. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally in the darkness. "You belong here now." Anna jumped out of her seat, her heart racing, her legs finally responding. She ran toward the door, her eyes struggling to see through the thick fog outside. As she reached for the handle, the man's voice came again, but this time it didn't come from behind her. It came from everywhere, as if it were emanating from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Stay with us." Anna pulled the door open and dashed outside, the fog enveloping her like cold, damp hands. She breathed heavily as she ran to her car, fumbling with the keys. She glanced back only once, and what she saw made the blood freeze in her veins. The restaurant was gone. The building, the lights, everything had disappeared, swallowed by the fog, leaving only emptiness and the empty road stretching behind her. With trembling hands, Anna started the car and sped down the road, her heart pounding as the fog began to lift, revealing the road ahead of her. She didn't stop until she reached the next town, collapsing in her car, too terrified to move. Weeks later, while trying to forget that night, she told her story to a friend who lived near Sable Creek. Her friend listened, pale and silent, before finally speaking. "There's no restaurant on that road, Anna," she said softly. "There never has been, but people say that sometimes when the fog is thick you can see the night griller. It disappeared decades ago, burned down after something terrible happened there." Anna's stomach twisted as she listened. "They say that anyone who eats there never comes back." It was supposed to be a simple road trip, just a few friends taking the scenic route, avoiding highways, and enjoying the freedom of the open road. Marcos, Julia, and Antonio had been driving for hours, passing through small towns and vast rural landscapes. As the sun set behind them, bathing the world in shades of purple and orange, the group's relaxed chatter began to fade. They hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and the road seemed to grow more desolate with each kilometer. "I'm hungry," Julia complained from the back seat, her stomach growling in protest. Marcos, who was driving, glanced at the gas gauge. "We should stop soon anyway. We're running low on gas." "There must be something up ahead," added Antonio, his eyes scanning the empty landscape. But the road stretched endlessly into the darkness. There were no lights, no signs of life. And then, as if the conversation had summoned it, a faint neon glow appeared in the distance. At first, they couldn't make out the words, but the soft hum of a restaurant sign was unmistakable. As they drew closer, the sign revealed its name: El Olivo Restaurant. The letters flickered in a dim yellow hue, casting an eerie glow over the gravel parking lot. The place looked like something out of another time, with its simple but well-kept exterior. "Thank God," murmured Julia, already opening the door as they parked. The three friends got out of the car, the night air suddenly colder than it had been all day. The restaurant was the only building in sight, standing alone in the middle of nowhere with no other cars in the lot. Marcos frowned. Something about the place felt off, as if they were intruding on something that wasn't meant for them. But his stomach growled too, and the smell of freshly made food wafted from inside. "Food is food," said Antonio, shrugging as he pushed the door open. Inside, the restaurant was modest, almost cozy. Dark wooden booths lined the walls, a long counter stretched across the back, and a small lamp cast a warm light over the tables. It was empty except for a single waitress behind the counter. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable, though her eyes seemed to linger on each of them for a moment too long. "Sit anywhere," she called in a flat, monotone voice. "The menus are on the table." The three friends exchanged uneasy glances but slid into a booth near the window. The place was oddly quiet. There was no music, no usual sound of plates or the hum of the kitchen, just the soft buzzing of the neon sign outside. The waitress approached with soft, almost imperceptible steps. She was middle-aged, wearing a simple uniform, and her face was pale and tired. "What can I get you?" she asked without bothering to pull out a notepad. Marcos looked down at the menu. It was basic: burgers, fries, sandwiches, but something at the bottom caught his eye. The house special. There was no description or price, just those words. "What's the special?" Marcos asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. The waitress's lips twisted into almost a smile. "You should try it," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's very popular." A shiver ran down Marcos's spine, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Something about the way she said it felt wrong, but he couldn't place what. "I'll just have a burger," Julia said quickly, clearly not in the mood for anything strange. "And fries, just a soda." "Same for me," added Antonio. Marcos hesitated, but eventually shrugged. "I'll take the special, I guess." The waitress's eyes seemed to flicker for a moment, a sort of glint crossing her gaze. "Good choice," she murmured before turning and walking toward the kitchen. The doors swung shut behind her, leaving the room in that uncomfortable silence once again. As they waited, the sense of unease in the air grew. The restaurant felt colder despite the warmth that had welcomed them. The neon sign outside flickered more frequently, casting distorted shadows through the windows. Julia and Antonio chatted, probably complaining about the long drive, but Marcos couldn't focus. His eyes kept drifting to the kitchen door. Everything was too quiet back there. The food arrived sooner than expected. The waitress placed Julia and Antonio's burgers in front of them, then carefully set Marcos's plate down. The special looked normal at first, a piece of roasted meat with fries and some salad. But the smell, it wasn't right. There was a strange metallic scent in the air, something bitter and unpleasant. Marcos's stomach churned as he looked at the plate. "Enjoy," said the waitress in a soft voice, her eyes still fixed on them. Julia and Antonio had already started biting into their burgers, but Marcos hesitated. He lifted the fork and cut into the meat. It looked overcooked, almost burnt, but not enough to explain the strange smell. With some reluctance, he cut a small piece and brought it to his mouth. The moment the meat touched his tongue, a wave of dizziness hit him. It tasted metallic, as if it had been soaked in copper. He felt his stomach twist as he forced the bite down, swallowing as the bitter and metallic taste lingered in his mouth. "Are you okay?" Antonio asked. Marcos nodded, though he felt far from okay. The food seemed to sit in his stomach like a heavy, cold stone. He pushed the plate aside, no longer hungry. The waitress stood behind the counter, still watching, her expression unchanged, but her eyes seemed more alert. "We should leave," Marcos muttered quietly, feeling fear creeping over him. Julia frowned at him. "What? You were the one who wanted to stop." Marcos didn't respond. He just felt a growing sense of dread. He glanced toward the window and noticed something strange. Two men stood next to a car parked far away, watching them. "Let's go now," Marcos said, his voice tense. The three of them quickly got up. As they exited, they noticed those men following them with their gaze as they climbed back into the car. Marcos drove as fast as he could, leaving the restaurant and the ominous feeling it gave them far behind. They knew something dark was going on there, and they had no intention of staying to find out. It was late autumn when Marcela found herself driving along the dark and winding roads of rural Salamanca. She was returning from a work conference, exhausted and hungry but eager to get home. Her GPS indicated that she still had about 2 hours left, and her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since midday. As the trees blurred past, painted in red and gold, she squinted through the windshield, searching for any sign of civilization. The road was deserted, surrounded by thick forests, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting shadows that danced with the wind. Just when she was about to give up and accept that she wouldn't find a place to stop, she spotted a small sign on the side of the road. La Loma Restaurant, open 24 hours, the sign read, the faded and cracked letters pointing toward a narrow road she had barely noticed. Without a second thought, she turned off the main road, hearing the crunch of gravel under the wheels as she drove down the dirt path. The restaurant appeared soon after. hidden among the trees like a beacon of warmth in the cold night. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting a soft red glow over the empty parking lot. Marcella parked her car and stepped out, adjusting her jacket to shield herself from the chilly wind. The place looked like something out of a time capsule. Its chrome exterior gleamed faintly under the dim light, and the smell of fried food lingered in the air. She smiled to herself, relieved to have found a place to eat. It looked quaint, like the type of spot that might serve a good homemade meal. As she opened the door, a bell rang softly and she entered. The interior was just as she had imagined. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with stools, and a jukebox that sat still in the corner. But something wasn't right. The place was empty. Too empty. Marcella glanced toward the counter where an elderly woman was cleaning a cup with a rag. Her gray hair was pulled back into a bun, and she wore an old apron that was visibly worn from time. The woman didn't look up immediately. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she had been doing the same thing for decades. "Sit wherever you like, dear," the woman finally said with a raspy but kind voice. Marcella hesitated for a moment, but chose a booth near the window. She picked up a menu from the holder and flipped through it, noticing that the prices seemed unusually low. As she scanned the options, she couldn't help but feel how the silence enveloped her. She couldn't hear the sizzle of a grill or the bubbling of a coffee pot, just the faint hum of the restaurant's lights. The waitress approached, still holding the cup and rag. "What can I get you, darling?" she asked with a stiff smile and an overly intense look. "Just a cheeseburger with fries," Marcella said, glancing at the menu, "and a coffee." The woman nodded, her smile still fixed. "I'll bring it right out." She disappeared behind a swinging door leading to the kitchen. Marcella settled into her seat and looked out the window. The trees outside swayed with the wind, their branches scratching the glass like restless fingers. The road beyond the restaurant seemed to fade into the darkness, and that was when she realized just how isolated the place really was. Time passed, and Marcella checked her phone. There was no signal. The minutes kept ticking by, but the food didn't arrive, and the restaurant's unsettling quiet began to disturb her. Now she could faintly hear sounds coming from the kitchen, a slow, rhythmic chopping, as if someone were cutting something, but at an oddly unhurried pace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the kitchen door opened, but it wasn't the elderly woman who came out. It was a tall, gaunt man wearing a stained apron. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembled slightly as he carried her plate. "Cheeseburger with fries," he said in a deep, low voice. He placed the plate in front of her with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you," Marcella murmured, feeling a wave of unease wash over her. She hadn't seen him when she entered, and his sudden appearance felt abrupt and unsettling. The man lingered a moment longer than necessary before returning to the kitchen without another word. Marcella looked down at her plate. The burger seemed normal, the fries golden and crispy, but the smell, there was something off about it. A faint sour odor emanated from the meat, mingling with the heavy grease. Suddenly her hunger faded and her discomfort grew. She pushed the plate aside and reached for her coffee, only to find that the cup was cold. Her sense of unease intensified with every passing second. The restaurant felt more and more like a place frozen in time. The booths seemed worn but unused. The jukebox was covered in dust, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air. Heavy, suffocating. Her eyes wandered to the wall at the back, where a bulletin board hung covered in old photographs. Feeling curious, she got up and walked over. The photos were yellowed with age and showed people smiling in the very restaurant she was in. Families, couples, truck drivers. But as she looked closer, she noticed something unsettling. The faces in the photos seemed strangely familiar. Marcella's heart raced when she recognized one of the women in the pictures. It was a young woman, no more than 20, standing next to the counter. She was wearing a jacket identical to Marcella's with the same hairstyle. That young woman was her. She stepped back, her breathing quickening, and started to examine the other photos in more detail. More familiar faces jumped out at her. People she had never met but somehow recognized. Faces that seemed too familiar, as if they were strangers she had once glimpsed on the streets, in the subway, or in crowded places. Her hands trembled as the horror of the situation sank in. These were people who had been here before, and they had never left. A loud noise came from the kitchen, breaking the silence, making Marcella turn sharply. The kitchen door opened slightly and she saw movement from the shadows. The gaunt man stood beyond the door, watching her. his eyes glinting in the dim light, unblinking, as if he were waiting for her to make a move. Marcella ran to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The bell above the door rang loudly as she pushed it open and sprinted toward her car. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and get inside. She started the engine and sped down the gravel path without looking back. Only when she was back on the main road, and the restaurant had disappeared completely from view, did she loosen her grip on the steering wheel. She was breathing heavily, but a strange calm began to envelop her as she looked ahead, leaving the darkness and the horror she had just experienced behind. She never spoke about the restaurant to anyone, but sometimes in the quiet of her apartment when she closed her eyes at night, she could still see the faces in those old photographs. Faces that looked too much like hers. Faces that had been trapped there for a very, very long time. It was the final stretch of Alejandro and Valeria's road trip, the road stretching into the seemingly endless night. They had spent the day driving through highways and back roads, stopping only for gas. Tired and hungry, they began to look for a place to eat. Alejandro squinted through the windshield while Valeria checked her phone, trying to find any nearby restaurant. "Everything's closed," Valeria said with frustration. "It's too late." Just as Alejandro was about to respond, a dimly lit sign appeared in the distance. El Paso Restaurant read the flickering letters, casting a faint red glow over the surrounding trees. It was located on a lonely stretch of road, like a relic from another era. The place seemed forgotten by time, set among dense woods with no other buildings in sight. "Looks like our best option," said Alejandro, turning into the cracked parking lot. Valeria hesitated, her gaze fixed on the restaurant, observing the peeling paint and the flickering lights. "It doesn't look very welcoming," she said softly. "We don't have many options," Alejandro replied as his stomach growled. "I'm really hungry." They both got out of the car, the cold night air biting as they approached the entrance. The restaurant's windows were dark, but a sign reading "Open 24 hours" flickered dimly next to the door. As they got closer, Valeria felt a strange sense of unease creeping up her spine. She tried to dismiss it as tiredness and hunger, but something about the place didn't feel right. Inside, the place was deserted. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, their seats cracked and worn with age. An old dusty jukebox stood in the corner, and the counter was empty except for a pile of faded menus. "Hello?" Alejandro called out into the empty space. There was no response. Valeria frowned, starting to think that maybe the place really was closed. "Maybe no one's here after all," she suggested. Alejandro had already grabbed a menu. "We might as well sit for a minute. Someone will show up." Reluctantly, Valeria slid into a booth across from Alejandro. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. Valeria glanced around. There were no customers, no sounds from the kitchen, not even any sign that someone had been there recently. Everything seemed as though it had been abandoned for years. Yet at the same time, it was strangely clean, too pristine for such an old place. "We should leave," Valeria whispered, feeling a growing unease in her stomach. "I don't like this place." Alejandro sighed and leaned back in the booth. "You're overreacting. It's just an old diner. We'll eat quickly and go." Before Valeria could protest, a door behind the counter swung open, and a tall man in a stained white apron stepped out. His face was expressionless, his eyes sunken and his skin pale. He moved with an unsettling slowness and deliberateness. Without saying a word, he handed them each a menu. His fingers were long and bony, and his nails were cracked and dirty. "What will you have?" he asked in a raspy, barely audible voice. Alejandro glanced at Valeria, but she just shook her head, her appetite gone completely. "A cheeseburger with fries," Alejandro finally said, "and a soda." The man turned his gaze to Valeria, who could barely hold his stare. "Nothing for me," she muttered. The man nodded and turned back, disappearing once again into the kitchen. Silence returned to the restaurant, heavy and oppressive. Valeria leaned forward, whispering urgently, "Alejandro, seriously, this place feels wrong. We should leave before it's too late." Alejandro sighed, exasperated. "Let's just relax for a bit, we're already here." Minutes passed and Valeria's sense of unease grew. The place was too still, as if they were being watched. She kept her eyes on the kitchen door, but there wasn't a single sound. It was as if time had stopped flowing in there. Finally, the man returned carrying a plate with Alejandro's burger. He placed it on the table without a word. The burger looked greasy, and the fries were soggy and limp. "Enjoy," the man murmured in his raspy voice before disappearing back into the kitchen. Alejandro stared at his plate. His appetite had faded too. Something about the food looked off. The meat had a strange grayish tint and the smell was metallic, as if something had spoiled. He picked up the burger hesitantly, but before he could take a bite, Valeria grabbed his wrist. "Don't do it," she whispered, her voice full of fear. "Something isn't right about this place." Alejandro sighed but set the burger down. "All right, let's just pay and go." As they stood up, something on the wall near the counter caught Valeria's attention. It was a bulletin board filled with old photographs. She walked closer, feeling a knot forming in her stomach. The photos showed people, families, couples, travelers, all smiling in front of the restaurant. But something was off. The faces in the images were blurred, distorted, as if they had been captured mid-scream. Valeria's heart raced as she scanned the photos. One in particular made her freeze. It was an old photo, yellowed with time. It showed a couple standing outside the restaurant, smiling. The woman had long dark hair and was wearing a blue jacket, the same as the one Valeria had on. And the man beside her looked exactly like Alejandro. "Alejandro," she whispered, her voice full of terror as she stepped back from the board. "We need to leave now." Before Alejandro could respond, they noticed something terrifying. The man from the kitchen had returned, and he wasn't alone. Shadowy figures began to emerge from the back, men and women with pale, empty faces, their eyes glassy and their skin taut, as if they hadn't moved in years. "Alejandro!" Valeria screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. They ran for the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, the handle cold and stiff under their hands. The dragging footsteps of the figures behind them grew louder. "Try the back door," Alejandro shouted, pulling her toward the side of the restaurant. They ran through the kitchen and a stench of rot and decay hit them like a wall. The kitchen was filthy, covered in grime and mold. The food left on the counters was spoiled, crawling with maggots. In a dark corner, something moved, something big and monstrous lurking in the shadows. They didn't stay to find out what it was. They ran for the back door, panting for breath, and pushed it open, escaping into the cold night air. They sprinted to the car, their hearts pounding, and Alejandro fumbled with the keys, finally managing to open the doors. They jumped in and the engine roared as they sped down the gravel path. The restaurant disappeared among the trees as they accelerated. Neither of them spoke, too terrified to process what they had just seen. But as the road stretched ahead, Valeria took one last look in the rearview mirror. The neon sign was gone. The restaurant was no longer there. It had vanished, swallowed by the night. The rain fell in thick sheets, making the narrow road slippery and treacherous. Lucia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as the windshield wipers struggled to keep the glass clear. She'd been driving for hours, lost in the middle of nowhere with her GPS constantly recalculating. She had passed the last gas station several miles back and her fuel tank was dangerously low. Suddenly, through the dense rain, she saw it. A restaurant by the side of the road, its neon sign flickering weakly. "El Faro Restaurant, open all night," it read. Lucia sighed with relief. She turned into the gravel parking lot, feeling the tires slide slightly over the wet stones. The restaurant looked old, as if it hadn't seen many customers in years, but the warm light glowing from the windows was welcoming. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten all day. This small restaurant seemed like a gift from heaven, a chance to get out of the storm, eat something, and maybe ask for directions. As she got out of the car, the rain pelted her like ice, soaking her immediately. She hurried toward the entrance, pushing the door open as the bell above her head jingled. Inside, the restaurant was empty, not a single customer in sight, and no sign of a waitress. There were just rows of red vinyl booths, an old jukebox in the corner, and the faint smell of fried food lingering in the air. "Hello?" Lucia called out, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet. From behind the counter, a figure appeared. A tall, gaunt man wearing a white apron. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles. He didn't smile or say a word, just nodded toward a nearby booth indicating she should sit. Feeling a growing discomfort, Lucia slid into the booth, the vinyl squeaking under her weight. "Can I have a coffee?" she asked, her voice trembling, unsure if it was from the cold or something else. The man nodded again without saying anything and went to the back, disappearing into the kitchen. Lucia picked up the menu, noticing that its edges were worn and the ink had faded. The options were simple: burgers, sandwiches, fries. But one thing at the bottom of the menu caught her attention: El Faro Special. There was no description, just those two words. The kitchen door swung open again, and the man came out with a steaming cup of coffee, placing it in front of her without a word. His hands were thin and bony, with long, yellowed nails. "What's in the special?" Lucia asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. For the first time, the man's lips curled into a sort of smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll like it," he said in a hoarse voice. "Everyone likes the special." Lucia's stomach turned, not from hunger but from a deep sense of foreboding. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the menu. But the hunger was still there, and the rain outside showed no signs of stopping. "All right," she said finally, her voice uncertain. "I'll have the special." The man nodded once again and vanished into the kitchen. Lucia took a sip of the coffee, grateful for the warmth it provided. But something about the restaurant's atmosphere felt off. The air was dense, almost oppressive. And although she couldn't see anyone else, she had the strange feeling that she wasn't alone. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching her from the back of the restaurant, but the place was empty. She checked her phone, but there was no signal, which only added to her sense of isolation. Minutes passed, long minutes, before the man returned with her plate. He set it down in front of her, a burger, fries, and a bit of coleslaw, but the smell coming from the plate wasn't right. Lucia stared at the food. The burger looked normal, the fries were golden, but there was a faint sour smell that made her hesitate. It was as if something in the meat was off. She pushed the plate aside, deciding it was better not to eat. "Is something wrong?" the man asked, standing next to the table, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm not that hungry," Lucia mumbled, trying to sound casual. The man remained there, his gaze fixed on her. "You should eat," he said more firmly. "It's fresh." "No, really, I think I'll just leave," she replied, standing up quickly. But as she did, the air in the restaurant seemed to grow heavier, denser. The man didn't move, but his expression changed. His face, previously expressionless, now showed a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. "No one leaves without finishing their meal," he whispered, his voice now low and threatening. Lucia's heart raced. The bell above the door suddenly rang, but when Lucia looked, the door hadn't opened. And then she saw it. In the corner of the restaurant, near the old jukebox, something moved. A shadow. At first it seemed like just an illusion, a trick of the dim light. But then it began to stretch, spreading across the floor, creeping slowly toward her. Lucia felt her skin prickle. Fear tightened her chest as she took a step toward the door, but the man immediately blocked her path, his face just inches from hers, his eyes glinting with a dark hunger. "Leaving so soon?" he whispered. "No one leaves." Lucia tried to push past him, but his cold, bony hand clamped around her wrist with surprising strength. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice deep and threatening. Panic overwhelmed her, and in a desperate move, she yanked her hand free. She sprinted toward the door, and when she reached it, the bell rang again. Though this time it sounded like a warning, a signal. She threw it open, running out into the blinding cold rain. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. Finally, the car started, and she sped down the gravel path, getting away from the restaurant as fast as she could. As the rain pounded against the windshield, she glanced in the rearview mirror. What she saw made her shiver. Through the fog and rain, she saw shadows, many shadows, standing inside the restaurant, all watching her. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty and lifeless. And in the middle of those figures was the man, smiling as he stared straight at her. Lucia didn't stop until she reached the next town, with the sound of the bell still echoing in her mind like a warning of what she had left behind. She never spoke about the restaurant to anyone, and never traveled that road at night again. But sometimes, in the quiet of her apartment, when the wind blew hard, she thought she could hear the soft tinkling of a bell, reminding her that there was something, or someone, that would never let her forget. The night was cold and still as Jorge drove along a long, empty stretch of highway. The headlights of his car barely cut through the dense darkness. He had been driving for hours, his eyes heavy with fatigue. What should have been a quick business trip had turned into a marathon of delays and detours, keeping him on the road much longer than planned. Now he just wanted to find a place to stop, rest a bit, and maybe grab a cup of coffee. As if fate had heard his need, a sign appeared up ahead, dimly lit by the glow of his headlights. La Esperanza Restaurant, open all night. An arrow pointed down a small path off the main road. Without thinking twice, Jorge turned the wheel and headed toward the restaurant. The sound of gravel crunched under the tires as he approached the small building that soon appeared before him. It was a small, old-fashioned restaurant with large windows and a neon sign that flickered weakly. The parking lot was empty, but that didn't surprise him. After all, it was the middle of the night. Jorge parked the car, stepped out, and walked toward the entrance, feeling the cold night air bite his skin. The bell above the door chimed softly as he opened it and stepped into the warm interior. The place had a classic look: checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and a long counter with stools. But what caught his attention was the silence. The restaurant was completely empty. No customers, no waitress behind the counter, nothing. Only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights that lit the place. "Hello?" Jorge called out, his voice echoing slightly in the still air. There was no answer. Frowning, he approached the counter and sat on one of the stools. At first, he felt relieved by the warmth of the place, but as the minutes passed, a sense of unease began to settle in. Something wasn't right. There was an oppressive feeling in the air, as if the restaurant was waiting, lurking. Just as he was about to get up and leave, the kitchen door suddenly swung open, and an elderly woman came out. She wore a faded blue apron, and her gray hair was tied in a loose bun. Her skin was pale and papery, but she smiled warmly when she saw him. "Good evening, dear," she said in a soft, though strained voice. "What can I get you?" Jorge felt some of the tension in his body ease. After all, he wasn't alone. "Just a coffee, please," he said, returning her smile. "And maybe a slice of pie if you have any." The elderly woman nodded and slowly turned toward the kitchen, moving with an almost painful slowness. Jorge watched as she disappeared behind the kitchen door. Something about the way she moved seemed odd, but he chalked it up to her age. A few minutes later, the woman returned with a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. She placed them in front of him with an even wider smile. "Enjoy," she said before disappearing into the kitchen once again. Jorge took a sip of the coffee but immediately winced. It was bitter, as if it had been reheated for hours. The pie wasn't much better, it was cold, as though it had been taken straight from an old refrigerator. He poked at it with his fork, feeling his appetite vanish. Then he heard a strange sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping as if something was gently tapping against the glass. Jorge looked up, staring toward the large windows that faced the road. He couldn't see anything, only the impenetrable darkness outside. Tap, tap, tap. The sound repeated, this time louder. Jorge squinted, trying to focus his eyes, but all he saw was his own reflection in the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound continued, now seeming to come from all around him. Jorge's heart began to race. He stood up from the stool and walked toward the window, hoping to see what was making the noise. The tapping stopped abruptly when he approached, leaving everything in silence once again. But then, he saw it. A figure moved in the reflection on the glass, not outside, but inside the restaurant, just behind him. Jorge froze, fear icing through his veins. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his head to look behind him. The restaurant, which had been empty just moments before, was now filled with people. Every booth, every stool was occupied by men and women sitting completely still. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, and their expressions blank. They didn't speak, they didn't move, they just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if waiting for something. Jorge's heart pounded as he stepped back, his eyes scanning the room. Where had they come from? It was impossible. They hadn't been there when he entered. Ding, the bell above the door chimed again, making Jorge spin around. The elderly woman stood at the kitchen door, but she was no longer smiling. Her eyes were fixed on him, and something had changed in her gaze. She no longer seemed warm, instead she looked cold and cruel. "You shouldn't have come here," she said in a low, firm voice. No one leaves. Panic surged through Jorge. He ran to the door, but when he pulled the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, as if fused to the frame. He yanked harder, his breath coming faster and faster. But the door didn't move. Behind him, the patrons remained motionless, but their empty eyes seemed to follow him. Their bodies didn't move, but a threatening presence filled the air, chilling his skin. "Let me out," Jorge yelled, pounding on the door, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence of the restaurant. Suddenly, the bell above the door chimed again, and Jorge turned to see the elderly woman approaching slowly, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. "You can't leave, dear," she whispered, her voice filled with a cold darkness. "This is your home now." With a strangled cry, Jorge yanked on the door with all his strength. This time it swung open, and he dashed out into the cold night air, not stopping until he reached his car. His hands trembled as he managed to fit the key into the ignition, and with his heart still pounding, he floored the gas, speeding away from the restaurant as fast as he could. He didn't look back. He couldn't. But as he drove down the dark highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching him. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the next town. The lights of civilization finally broke through the oppressive darkness, but the terror still clung to him. And every time he found himself back on the road, every time he was alone on a dark highway, he believed he could hear that soft tap, tap, tap against the glass, a warning or perhaps an invitation to return to that restaurant he should never have visited. Andrea was on her way home after a long shift at the hospital. Her body was tired, but her mind was still alert from the extra hours she had worked. She had been driving for almost an hour when the rain started to fall heavily, darkening the desolate road. Fatigue and hunger were beginning to affect her, and her GPS indicated that there were no gas stations or restaurants nearby. As the windshield wipers struggled to keep the glass clear, Andrea spotted a distant sign illuminated by flickering lights. "Café Los Robles, open all night." Without a second thought, she turned into the small gravel parking lot in front of the cafe. The car skidded slightly on the wet ground before coming to a complete stop. The place looked old, with the neon lights barely flickering and the windows showing a warm, cozy interior. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the morning. She got out of the car, shielding herself as best as she could from the pounding rain. As she entered, a small bell jingled, announcing her arrival. The interior was modest, with red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and a long counter with stools. Despite the warm atmosphere, Andrea noticed the place was completely empty. Only an elderly woman stood behind the counter, wiping a cup with an old rag. "Sit wherever you like, dear," the woman said with a soft smile and a tired voice. Andrea nodded and settled into a booth by the window, watching the rain fall in thick sheets. She pulled out her phone, searching for a signal, but there was no coverage. As she browsed through the menu, the woman slowly approached. "What can I get you?" she asked with a forced smile. "A coffee and a grilled cheese sandwich with fries, please," Andrea replied, returning the smile. The woman nodded and went back to the counter. As Andrea waited, a strange sense of unease began to grow within her. The place was too quiet, too still, as if it were disconnected from the outside world. Outside, the rain continued to pound against the windows, and the road appeared completely deserted. A few minutes later, the woman returned with a steaming cup of coffee. "The grilled cheese will be ready in a moment," she said before returning to the kitchen. Andrea took a sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her body. However, something wasn't right. The coffee tasted bitter, as if it had been reheated multiple times. At the same time, a couple entered the cafe, drenched from the rain. They didn't say a word as they sat down in a booth near the entrance. Both had pale faces and sunken eyes, as if they were exhausted. Her feeling of unease intensified. Andrea glanced at them out of the corner of her eye as the woman returned with her food. "Here you go, dear," she said, placing the plate in front of her. Andrea took a bite of the grilled cheese, but the taste made her pause. The bread had a faint smell of mold, and the cheese tasted old. The fries, instead of being crispy, were cold and soggy, as if they had come straight from the freezer. She pushed the plate aside, feeling her hunger vanish completely. Suddenly, the bell above the door rang, but no one had entered. Andrea looked toward the entrance, and then she saw it. a shadow moving in the window's reflection, not outside but inside the cafe. She felt a chill run down her spine. Slowly she turned, expecting to see someone behind her, but the cafe remained empty aside from the couple who sat motionless in their booth. The sense of fear grew. Andrea got up, ready to pay and leave as quickly as possible. But when she reached the counter, the woman was staring at her with a smile that no longer seemed friendly. "Are you leaving without finishing your meal?" she asked, her voice soft but laden with something dark. "I'm not hungry," Andrea muttered, trying to stay calm. "No one leaves without finishing their meal," the woman said, stepping forward, her face now completely expressionless. Andrea felt the panic rising within her. She turned quickly toward the door, but the bell rang again before she could reach it. Something had changed in the air. The lights began to flicker, and the cafe that had once seemed cozy was now shrouded in a cold darkness. She ran to the exit, pushing the door with all her strength, but when she looked back, she saw something that made her freeze. The cafe's windows no longer displayed a warm interior. Everything was dark, and the shadows moving inside seemed to be watching her with empty, lifeless eyes. Andrea didn't stop until she was in her car. She started the engine with trembling hands and drove away as fast as she could. As she sped down the highway, the fear followed her like a presence that wouldn't let her go. Although she never spoke about Café Los Robles again, every time she drove down a deserted road at night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching her from the darkness.